Thank you for waiting, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for remaining until the late hours. So many questions have been received. It was hard for us to try to select, and some people have written a lot of questions with small letters. It was very hard for me to read. But in any case, even with the extension, we have to end by 5 o'clock. So I have to apologize beforehand that we will not be able to entertain all the questions. But having said so, there were certain questions that we have received from multiple number of people. So I would like to paraphrase them to ask those common set of questions. Since we have Ms. Wendy Cutler with us in the panel, so this is a major question. Going forward, what would be the order for international trade going forward be? The ASEAN, there are countries who have joined the TPP and not joined the TPP. And the division within the ASEAN, would it persist or not? And thinking about the future international trade order, for example, Japan and EU is engaged in negotiation for Japan-EU EPA. It will take a little bit more time, but I'm sure this will be concluded. And the United States and EU is also trying to agree on the TTIP, and the negotiation is still progressing, although it may take some more time, but eventually the agreement will be reached. Then, when we think of global trade order, so you have the TPP, and in case of EU and Japan, it will be more of a high standard, high quality EPA will be achieved, and between EU and the United States, it will also be very high grade, high standard, because it is just the industrialized economies. So, for the region where very high standard of EPAs are covering, but then TPP is a little bit different. You have developing economies also as members, but there could be some big division, a dividing line between those high standard economic agreements, trade agreements, and those who will not be that high standard. So will there be a division to persist, or will it be convergence to more of a high standard like TPP, TTIP, or EU-Japan? Or do you think that the gap between the two would be wide and lasting or not? So the mega picture, what would be the future order for international trade in 10 years or perhaps 20 years' time? That, I believe, is the question asked. So, Ms. Cutler, would you like to respond?
How much time do I have?
30 seconds, no. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes.
I'm only kidding, because that's a lot of questions and obviously some very big issues. But let me just comment a bit, having worked in the trade field now for over 30 years. You know, a lot of people have said or accused the United States of abandoning the multilateral trading system and moving towards these regional and bilateral free trade agreements. And I think that's a very unfair assessment. The United States places high priority on the multilateral trading system. And I think it's fair to say that that's kind of the optimal solution for trade liberalization. But in practice, it just hasn't worked. And the WTO's ability to negotiate trade agreements that go above the WTO standards among all the WTO countries has been extremely difficult. And so the question is, if you can conclude a deal on issues with all of the WTO members, do you stop negotiating, or do you find other ways you can negotiate with so-called like-minded countries? And that's the approach that the United States has chosen along with other countries. And in that respect, there are really two sub-approaches have been used. One is to negotiate regionally or bilaterally with countries, or two, to find sectoral issues to work on and negotiate liberalization on with a smaller group of countries, the so-called plurilaterals, whether it be on environmental goods or the services negotiations taking place in Geneva. So when I look at the future of the world trading system, I see that the ultimate goal for everyone will continue to be multilateral agreements and including everyone. But I do think that we're going to see more deals with those groups of countries that are willing and interested in doing a trade agreement in a certain area or with certain countries. But the good news is there are other initiatives underway. Some may not be as high standard, but as long as they all share the same objective of trade liberalization, and as long as there's not inconsistencies between these agreements, I don't think the world as we know it in trade is going to collapse like some academics suggest. So I do think that all of these different initiatives can coexist. And the importance, once again, is that the negotiators ensure that there are not conflicts and inconsistencies between these agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, to the question that I raised, if there are comments from other panelists, may I invite them now? If you could raise your hand, please. Professor Watanabe and Ambassador Fujisaki, if you have any objections to raise with Ambassador Fujisaki, that's also welcome too. Well, Ambassador Fujisaki, prior to the coffee break, gave a comment, an opposing comment, and the future state of a global trade order, those two are related with each other. And I think Ambassador Fujisaki understood that, and that's why he made some provocative comments. There are three mega regions that exist today. Europe, centering around the EU, and on the other side of the Pacific, NAFTA, North America, and going to South American countries, Mercosur, including Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and across the Andes, Alianza Pacifica, the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, where Dr. Solis comes from. So that's the Americas, and East Asia, that's the third. East Asia and the Americas, the countries on the Pacific side of the Americas, with the Asian countries, were agreeing on the TPP. And with respect to the EU, as was mentioned, Japan-EU EPA is now being negotiated, and the EU and North America are negotiating TTIP. And what's being discussed is investment, competitive policy, and government procurement. So these are the issues that were to be negotiated by the WTO rounds. Ever since the 2003 Cancun meeting, rulemaking has failed. So government procurement, investment, and so forth in those areas, TPP, TTIP, and Japan-EU are negotiating those issues that were not successfully negotiated by the WTO. So this is an opportunity to expand the league of like-minded countries. It's not just the developed countries. Developing countries can, of course, be included. I watched over Uruguay round talks in Geneva for 5 years. One of the characteristics of the Uruguay round is that its objective was to create a critical mass of like-minded countries. In the Uruguay round, that was possible. A critical mass was created. Unfortunately, currently, Japan has TPP with the US, and Japan-EU EPA with the EU, and the EU is engaged in talks with the US as well. So the negotiators and the government officials should work to converge the views and come to agreement in terms of investment and government procurement and so forth. And that way, we will be able to create a broad set of rules for both developed and developing countries. It may not be a perfect multilateralism, but after accumulating such efforts, we may be able to come up with something more coherent, backed by like-mindedness. So what failed in the WTO perhaps can be restored. So in that regard, TPP is important, TTIP as well as Japan, EU, EPA. And the question is, how can we involve more of the developing countries? By so doing, we can achieve some sort of multilateralism.
Please. Brief.
Just very briefly, to add to this discussion about the future of the international trade order, I would like to highlight one element that has not been focused on, and that is that the nature of the trade agenda itself has changed over time. And this has to do with the success of the WTO, if you will, successive rounds of multilateral trade negotiations that brought down average tariff levels, but also has to do with the way in which international production and trade have been transformed in the past 20 years. So much so that now global supply chains are a major source of wealth creation, so much so that we used to think of trade mostly as whole products crossing borders. Well, now that is not where the real action or most of the action is, but actually trading components, trading services, capital flows, information and data flows. That's actually a very, very vibrant sector. And we need rules that address those types of economic transactions. That means that we now have a very different sort of negotiation. And it's a much more complex negotiation because we're talking about behind the border areas. So there is some pushback from domestic publics about what the boundary is. And also because it means that it's hard sometimes to reconcile the needs of countries at different levels of development. In the United States, many people tend to refer to the TPP as a US-Japan trade agreement, and of course it is that. But I would like to highlight that the TPP is much more than that. I see great promise in the fact that you have a diverse group of countries at different levels of development. That's why I very much hope that all countries make it to the ratification line, certainly countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, because they hint at the possibility that perhaps there is possible to find convergence. And my last point, I think we should not lose sight of the very important fact that we have not had a success of this magnitude at the negotiation table like the TPP in a very long time, and the demonstration effect of that, I think it's also important to keep in mind. Thank you.
どうもありがとうございました。あとですね、たくさんご質問をいただいたのが。
Thank you very much. We have also had many people asking questions on AIIB. And the title of the symposium says Building a New Economic and Financial Order. That AIIB is directly related to the financial order. And the questions are being asked of many speakers on AIIB. What is the relevance and importance of the AIIB, and whether Japan and United States should have joined the AIIB, and why Europe has joined in the AIIB? Those are some of the questions asked. So any comments on AIIB, please, Ms. Cutler? You may not be directly responsible for the AIIB, but then any other panelists, and Professor Terada, and then Dr. Solis, in that order, please. Thank you, Professor Kubo. Yes, we did not touch upon the AIIB that much. But in the 20 to 30 years ago, in the context of, in the 20 to 30 years from now onwards, in that context, the AIIB is also relevant. The South China Sea is dividing up the ASEAN. That is more important. But the TPP is also dividing the ASEAN. But when it comes to Laos, PDR, Cambodia, the Myanmar, and so forth, for free trade, to have to closely work with the United States, to have one same market. I'm sure you can go to those countries and feel it yourself. It's quite difficult. What is being needed? Capital. Or that infrastructure is lacking and missing, then trade is very difficult for them if there is no infrastructure. What Japan has experienced in the 1940s, 1950s, their level of economies is still in that range. For them to immediately join the TPP is, of course, impossible. You have to go through the different stages. And Japan was also a developing nation in the past. To jump forward, to become a member of the industrialized countries club, you need to go through steps. And who would capitalize them? Who would try to fund them? And China says that China is representing the developing world. But when it comes to the economy and the foreign reserve, it is the world's #1 in terms of foreign reserve and the world's #2 when it comes to the size of the economy. So for what the developing economies need, China has tried to assist them. But when and why Japan and US? AIIB has not been officially launched, but if and when Japan and US joins the AIIB, what we have been accustomed to in providing aids or the investments and providing the ODA, we may have to change the way of doing things, perhaps downgrading, for example. What has been discussed earlier, the rules making, TPP is a high standard agreement, is what have been often said by the other speakers. But you need to make infrastructure investment being friendly to the environment. That has been done by Japan and US and others. But looking at China, in its ODA policy, that has not been complied with. There's a lot of dust and soot. And in Vietnam, the roads are so dusty, but it has been built by China, for example. So Japan and US, can we really condone that? Can we really accept that in terms of rules of the economic investment? When it comes to trade rules, the TPP as well as TTIP and Japan EU FTA and Japan Australia FTA, I'm not really sure whether it will be FTAP or not, but many developing economies of the world cannot really join yet. Then what should be the economic order, not only in trade, but the economic order should be created, investment and assistance, those countries who need to further grow. You need to have some kind of framework. World Bank cannot really do that. And ADB, it takes time because the rules are too stringent. And China is saying that they would ignore those existing rules, but they will still go ahead with infrastructure investment. And ASEAN has joined in, and Central Asian countries have also joined in. But the problem is that Europe has also joined. Even though Europe is an advanced economy, with Europe joining, so Japan and the United States must rethink our own position. Perhaps we need to think about something different from what we have done. So Prime Minister Abe, for the recent months, had been saying that we will change slightly the rules for providing the funds. I'm not really sure whether this would give a push for Japan and US to join the AIIB in the future or not. But the power of China is with the economic part to do with the development. And how will it have impact in trying to widen up the scope of the regions? AIIB is a tool to do that. There was mentioned the coalition and like-minded countries, as suggested by Professor Watanabe. There are even more number of like-minded countries joining the AIIB. So what should Japan and US do? We are left behind. So what would happen to the global order of trade if AIIB continues to grow? So Professor Solis, please.
Thank you very much. With AIIB, I think it's very clear that China is now ready to try to exert more influence in international economic stage. It's coming forward with a new institutional proposal. It's identified a very important problem, that is the deficit in infrastructure finance, and has laid out what for many countries a very compelling formula. You know, there are things there like open procurement, universal recruitment, and you know, the idea that this will be a lean, clean machine. So I think that it is important to acknowledge that as China becomes a larger economy, understandably there's going to be a desire to play a larger role, just like Japan did when it was in its path of growing and becoming a more important player. With AIB, I think China is going to perhaps be extremely careful because I think it understands there's a lot of international scrutiny and people are going to form opinions on the quality of Chinese leadership depending on how the bank evolves. The one initiative we haven't discussed here, where actually I think I'm a little more concerned because there's less transparency, is a One Road, One Belt initiative, where it's not clear that these high standards will be enacted. Having said that, I actually agree with the position taken by the United States and Japan of adopting at this moment a wait-and-see approach. I think it's important to encourage China, as always, to apply these high-level standards, but it's also important to see if it actually is going to carry them out at the implementation stage. There's one very important pending issue in my mind, and that is that China seems to be saying to us that it can have it both ways, that it can have a streamlined organization, when you don't have this bureaucratic red tape, can move very fast in loan approval, but at the same time is going to respect environmental and human rights standards and so forth. And to me, it remains to be seen whether China can really have it both ways, because in many ways, you have those, the protection of those standards by having these bureaucratic procedures in place. So these governance issues need to be worked out at the actual implementation stage. But even if you take a wait-and-see approach, that doesn't mean that you just fold your arms and do nothing. And I think I'm actually more impressed with what Japan has done than what the United States has done. I think that Japan moved very quickly, for example, towards the reform of the ADB to streamline decision-making, to increase operational lending capabilities. It's also going to reform the Japan Bank for International Cooperation so it can undertake greater risk in financing, and I think that the quality infrastructure initiative is important, and I think that now that Japan, for example, is going to chair G7, one area where it could be very productive is to come forward with standards and criteria to evaluate what does high-quality infrastructure finance looks like, and try to bring China into that conversation later in the G20. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。アルベルト先生お願いいたします。
ありがとうございます。
Thank you.
AIB ですけども、
Now, with regard to AIB,
確か会議の中では
TPP and AIIB, there was a contrast to be discussed within this framework of a symposium, as Professor Kubo mentioned. As Mireya mentioned, that One Road, One Belt is going to be an initiative that contrasts with TPP. However, what is underlined is to be AIIB. So this initiative is supported by AIIB. With regard to the significance of AIIB, in Asia there's a lack of infrastructure. It is a well-known fact. So public goods to be provided, and that role is to be offered by AIB. If that is the case, then it has its own significance. But what is problematic is, Mireya and Professor Terada mentioned, there is an issue of governance. That means, in other words, in what way and what area and what kind of fund is going to be offered, and how the decision is going to be made. Is it going to be made in transparency and in an equitable manner? If that is the case, then for this region and for the world, for the rest of the world, this is going to be an important financial institution. But it has not been officially launched yet. For example, that China will have the veto power in terms of the allocation of finances. If that is the case, then even other countries, member countries, favor, but China may oppose. And as a result, the veto power will enable China's cause to be accepted. That means Chinese favorable projects are going to be prioritized. There is such a risk. That kind of concern needs to be dispelled in order to put in place the governance structure. If so, then it is going to be a favorable option for the region. China and other emerging economies, those economies with a growing GDP, but when it comes to existing institutions like ADB, IMF, and World Bank, their voice is not proportionate to the economic power. at the IMF, there is a veto power exercised by the United States. So if China has its own reason to justify the existence of AIIB, that's understandable. But going forward, what is most important is that AIIB will be able to offer public goods in an equitable and a transparent manner. If that is going to be the case, then that would be a good way to pursue. But what kind of role should be played by the United States and Japan in this regard, entering the AIIB in order to secure good governance and such practice is going to be monitored by joining the membership. But at this point in time, it is impossible. But once AIIB is launched, and if the governance is maintained in an appropriate manner, and if it is verified, then both Japan and the United States should join AIIB. But until then, there should be external cooperation to be offered by Japan if there is such request is made.
So, Professor Watanabe, anything to supplement? Yes, thank you. On the question of AIIB, as Professor Urata has said, the One Belt, One Road concept, that it is directly linked to that concept. There's one more factor that I would like to introduce to the audience, which is SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This was established in 2001. China, Russia are members, and the former Soviet Union, the republics in Central Asia, like the Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Belarus, are included. So the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, seems to be a new architecture for political cooperation amongst the member countries. And when I read ministerial statements, what I'm surprised is that the human rights and rule of law are being actually celebrated. And in Kazakhstan, the president, the same president persists for 18 years. And this is good for the political stability, is being said in the statement. And in the back of that, rule of law, human rights, democracy, there are lots of distortions, but still they are applaud and commend these values. So when they say human rights or the market economy or the rule of law, are they same when we say and we speak of the same terms or not? The SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for those countries who have joined the SCO, to provide infrastructure development assistance, that I believe is the ulterior motive of the AIIB establishment. So if the public goods, what about the international public goods? The international financial institution to provide public goods. So AIIB may be totally different from, for example, ADB or World Bank and others. The advanced countries, through the official development assistance, have been providing a lot of aid to the developing countries. They always stress the rule of law, democracy, and environmental standards. There are OECD DAC, the rules that you need to comply with. Democracy or human rights, from those perspectives, perhaps more inferior projects could also be selected to make investment. So on the surface, even though they would actually, in a noble manner, speak of the rule of law or the human rights, it may be qualitatively very different, which may invite the quality to be degraded going forward for assistance to infrastructure development. On the other hand, if United States join, from inside you can change and make reform. That is what is being contended by Prime Minister Cameron of the United Kingdom. But if it is 5% or 6% share allocation, you will not be able to overturn the China's position because it has more than 30% or even close to 40%. So it has a blocking majority. But then for Japan and the United States to remain outside, paradoxically would be a good contribution to the AIIB that Japan and US have opted not to join has been understood fully by China, and China doesn't like this. So when Japan and US remain outside, this could actually remedy the AIIB governance to try to improve on the quality of the governance. So paradoxically, that could happen.
We're running out of time, so this will be my last question directed to the U.S. panelists. Dr. Fukushima, who haven't spoken, and Ms. Cutler from both your positions. How do you assess the Abe administration? Ms. Cutler, from your perspective, Mr. Abe's administration has been your negotiating counterpart, and you said nice things about Minister Amari, but was he a formidable negotiator to deal with? Was he cooperative in the end? Was he indeed formidable, would you say? So if you could share your views as to Abe administration. And Dr. Fukushima, we now have TPP with the joint leadership of Japan and the U.S. And U.S.-Japan alliance will be favorably impacted by that. But some view Mr. Abe as a dangerous nationalist. Some U.S. people think so. So he made a speech in the U.S. Congress 14th of August. He delivered a commemorative statement commemorating the 70th anniversary of World War II. He was not all that belligerent in the statement, so perhaps the views toward Prime Minister Abe have somewhat changed. So what are your views on Mr. Abe? Now, may I ask Ms. Cutler first?
Well, with respect to the TPP negotiations, there's no doubt in my mind that not only Japan's participation, but Japan's ability to conclude the negotiation with the other 11 countries was due to the leadership of Prime Minister Abe. As a result, where we are hand in hand with Japan in the TPP is, I think, once again, largely attributable to the fact that the Japanese negotiating team was very focused, very well prepared, very skillful, and also, frankly, defended their national interest very effectively. All that said, they were at the table to do a deal. And I think that was the direction from Prime Minister Abe, that he had the vision to realize that TPP meant a lot to Japan, both economically and from a geostrategic point of view. And therefore, the team that was selected under the leadership of Minister Amari was really, top rate, first class, tough, but yet they knew how to close a deal and how to find what we call landing zones that allowed us for the successful conclusion. So I had the highest respect for this negotiating team. Did I like them every day of the negotiation? Did I go home every night and think, God, they are great? No. And did they think that about me? No. Did they think that about our team? No. But overall, I think there was just a very deep mutual respect, mutual trust, and a shared objective, which was absent from earlier trade negotiations.
Thank you, Glenn Fukushima. Floor is yours.
The Abe government came into office in December of 2012, a couple of months after I returned to Washington, D.C. And I'd have to say that during the first few months, there was a kind of a honeymoon period of welcoming a certain level of stability in the Japanese government, and also a prime minister who has through his career, emphasized the importance of U.S.-Japan relations. There was some potential concern about history issues. I think in April of 2013, when he made some comments about the definition of aggression, that raised some concerns in the United States. And then in December of 2013, when he went to Yasukuni Shrine, that resulted in some statement of disappointment by the United States. Since that time, however, I think certainly in April last year when President Obama visited Japan, and most recently when the Prime Minister visited the United States, these were both very successful visits by the President to Japan and also by the Prime Minister to the United States. And I think especially his having gone to 4 different cities, not only Washington, D.C., but also the Boston area, the San Francisco area, and Los Angeles, all pointed to the importance that the Abe government places on the United States, and also I think Obama administration very much welcomed the developments on the security, national security side of cooperation between the U.S. and Japan, and also with regard to progress on TPP and efforts by the Japanese government to revive the Japanese economy. I think in the meantime, the U.S. relationship with China has become more strained compared to 3 years ago. And I think that there has been some positive movement between Japan and South Korea and between Japan and China. And therefore, I think the concern that the administration had earlier on about the difficulty of coordinating between the United States and South Korea and Japan, those concerns have become less than in the past. And I think that with regard to issues like the Senkaku Islands, with the President in his visit to Japan in April clearly announcing for the first time for the President of the United States that those islands fall under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and also that the United States welcomes Japan's movement on collective self-defense. These plus the revisions of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty guidelines, I think all of these have contributed to a very positive and cooperative relationship over the last couple of years. So I would say right now that the U.S.-Japan relationship is in a very positive and constructive stage, and I think with TPP, assuming this goes through, that it will provide another basis, as Wendy mentioned during her presentation, of the U.S. and Japan being able to cooperate even more than in the past with regard to the economic architecture of East Asia. And I would anticipate on the security side, too, that there would be more progress. So overall, I'd say that the relationship is doing very well.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, may I ask Ambassador Fujisaki, if you criticize one particular individual too much, it would take too long a time to rebut, so if you could please careful about that. During the break, I wanted to speak with Professor Watanabe, then Professor Watanabe had refused. Now, this is a joke, but he refused because he wanted us to come to conclusion in front of the audience. There's one point on China. The AIIB and One Belt, One Road concept, all the ideas that have come from China, and they're asking all the others to join in a nutshell. But if China is more or less one-sided and less unilateral, but ask around with the others' view, and then everyone would be happy to join in the bandwagon. Perhaps China should change a little bit from just one-sidedly coming up with ideas and ask others to join without any further ideas to be added. But China as a dragon, there seems to be too much of an extreme, the argument that the China as a dragon is too huge, that China is overtaking the United States. But this is too extreme an argument. For example, several decades ago, Japan as number one, that seems to be the big debate, and the United States was afraid that Japan may take over, but that did not happen. The elephant in the room, the giant elephant, America should appreciate, and they should not be the too concerned of this. And one last remark, Japan should be stronger. Why did the Prime Minister Abe's visit to the U.S. was so successful? Why his statement at the Congress was so welcomed? That is because Prime Minister Abe and his party has majority in both houses of the Japanese Diet, and to trying to make the Japanese economy stronger. And with that foundation, you would be able to enjoy a better relationship between Japan and the United States. And Japan should be stronger because of that. And for China, I hope that China would rethink it being too one-sided and too unilateral, and the United States not to be concerned too much, and Japan to be much stronger.
Thank you for all the questions from the audience. We took up common issues, broader issues, and so that was my policy of selecting the questions. I was not able to take them all. I hope you will understand. In a symposium like this, I have served as a moderator, but I haven't had this large a panel with 9 panelists. It's been a challenge for me in terms of time management. So my apologies if I created any inconveniences on the part of the members of the audience. And with that, we would like to conclude the second part of the panel discussion. Please give a big round of applause to all the panelists.
Professor Kubo and all the panelists, thank you very much. The panelists will get off the stage. Please give them another round of applause.